Hi, friends. Today we will reveal the mystery of Bitcoin. Does it have a future? And who really created it? And most importantly, why are governments against cryptocurrency? On a black screen, a date appears. October 31st, 2008. On that day, the world was occupied with entirely different problems. Banks were collapsing one after another. Millions of Americans were losing their homes. Europe was drowning in debt. Governments were scattering promises that the system is under control. But while newspaper headlines screamed of crisis, in one corner of the internet a file appeared. 9 pages of text. The title, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Author, Satoshi Nakamoto. This was not just a document. It was the seed from which a whole new financial reality grew. A paper, written in dry technical language, promised the most terrifying thing for states and banks: money that would exist without them. Money independent of central banks, politicians, and bureaucrats. Money that cannot be counterfeited, frozen, or seized. That is why we can call this moment the birth of a shadow. No one knew who was hiding behind the name: a person, a group of programmers, hackers, a spy, a genius. But 9 pages of a PDF file became what, 10 years later, would be called digital gold. Symbolically, the first line of the Bitcoin blockchain forever recorded a reminder of that era. In block number 0, a hidden note: The Times, 03 Jan 2009 Chancellor, on brink of second bailout for banks. This is the headline of the British newspaper, The Times, from January 3, 2009. Satoshi embedded it into the very fabric of Bitcoin, as if encrypting a message. This project was born as a protest against banks that saved themselves at the expense of ordinary people. So the story began. But if you think everything was simple, you are mistaken. Because behind 9 pages of the document was a much darker question. Who was this person who challenged the entire global financial system? The financial crisis of 2008 was not just another stock market crash. It was the collapse of faith. Banks that for decades had seemed unsinkable suddenly fell to their knees. Lehman Brothers, a giant with a century-old history, collapsed in a single morning. The global economy shook with scandals. Millions of people lost their homes because of mortgages that had seemed reliable just yesterday. Governments hurriedly launched rescue programs. Trillions of dollars were printed to patch the holes in the financial system. And it was precisely then that Bitcoin was born. Nakamoto's text was not just a technical description of a new digital currency. It was a manifesto. In every line there was a challenge. We no longer trust you. You betrayed us. Now we will create money without you. Blockchain, decentralization, the absence of intermediaries. These were not just pretty words. This was a verdict on the banking system, which lived on trust, and suddenly showed that this trust was worth less than the paper on which dollars were printed. Satoshi saw the problem at its core. Banks had always said, "We guarantee your money. We are the intermediaries. Without us, the system will collapse." But the crisis proved the opposite. Banks turned out to be the weak link. They lost their own game and were saved only thanks to the state. And who paid? The people, their taxes, their savings, their homes. Bitcoin was the answer. No more intermediaries. Money will belong only to you. This manifesto was written in the dry language of a programmer, but its meaning was explosive. For the first time in history, there appeared a project that encroached upon the sacred, the monopoly of states to print money. For many, it seemed a utopia. For others, a dangerous joke. But there was a small circle of enthusiasts who read Nakamoto's text and felt, this is not just an idea, This is a weapon. That is why the first Bitcoin transaction became a symbol, like the first step on the moon. Not because it was technically difficult, but because it was a statement: we can live without your rules. January 3rd, 2009. On an ordinary winter day, while the world was discussing new bank bailout packages, what we today call the blockchain was launched online. The first block, the Genesis block. It was mined by Satoshi Nakamoto himself, and with it came the first Bitcoin transaction in history. This event passed quietly, almost unnoticed. There were no front-page news stories, no applause or television broadcasts. But at that very moment, a new type of money appeared in the world. Not a piece of paper with the finance minister's signature, not a record in a bank, but a line in a distributed system that cannot be forged. The first person to receive Bitcoin was Hal Finney, a programmer, cryptographer, one of those enthusiasts who immediately understood what was hidden in 9 pages of the white paper. Hal launched the client, and the first transaction from Satoshi landed in his wallet. Just 10 coins. They were worth nothing. You couldn't buy bread or coffee or even a place on a hard drive with them. But it was precisely those 10 coins that became the starting point of a new economy. Finney later wrote in his blog, "When Satoshi launched the network, I was one of the first to download the program and the first to receive a transaction." For him, it wasn't just a program. It was a living experiment. He felt if the system holds up, one day, the world will change. But at that moment, no one in the world paid attention. Bitcoin was a game for geeks, a toy for those who loved cryptography. However, in those first transactions, a new world was being born. Because from that moment, there existed money that no one could stop. It is symbolic that everything began with ordinary people's computers. Not bank servers, not data centers, but simple PCs at home. Anyone could mine coins. Anyone could participate in the network. And this is precisely what made the project dangerous for those used to controlling everything. But to understand who Satoshi might have been, one must look at the author himself. His style, his words, his silence. Because sometimes a person is revealed not by what he does, but by how he disappears in the text. Who is Satoshi Nakamoto? From the very beginning, this question became not just a curiosity. It turned into a global mystery. On forums and articles and conference backrooms, everyone argued, from student programmers to former intelligence agents. And the more they searched for an answer, the more the myth grew. Nakamoto himself wrote in flawless English, but with slight traces of British style. The times of his publications often coincided with the Japanese time zone, although in his profile he listed Japan. His letters were polite, dry, and extremely cautious. He never revealed anything extra, allowed no personal details, never answered questions about himself. It seemed he cut all humanity out of his texts, leaving only code and the idea. But even in this silence, hints appeared. His communication style was too academic for a simple hacker, too precise for an undergrounder, too independent for a corporation. Some said, it's a lone genius. Others claimed, one person doesn't write like this, there's a team behind it. The mystery was fueled also by the fact that Bitcoin is not just code. It is philosophy. Whoever wrote it clearly understood not only programming, but also economics, cryptography, and the philosophy of freedom. This required not one talent, but an entire set. Too much for one person, or precisely the sign of a true genius. And the more one looked into Nakamoto's texts, the more questions appeared. They lacked the sloppiness typical of programmers. He wrote like a person who knew every word would be examined under a microscope. Perhaps he wanted to be searched for. Perhaps it was part of the game. But how does one search for a shadow? Some began analyzing his writing style, others his activity times, and still others the code itself. And each time new versions appeared. Some pointed to specific people, others saw intelligence agencies behind it. And the deeper they dug, the more tangled the story became. To understand more, one had to return to the traces, to the emails, forums, and lines of code Nakamoto left behind. Because it is often in the details that the truth hides. Nakamoto's traces are not fingerprints, not photographs, not documents. They are emails, forum posts, and lines of code. It would seem that digital shadows should disappear, but they became evidence for hunters of the truth. The first thing that stands out: style. Satoshi wrote carefully, without slang. His English was almost perfect, but in it cropped up British expressions, like bloody hard or flat. This led many to think he was British. But his forum activity often coincided with American working hours. And in his profile he listed Japan. Too many masks for one person. The second, his code. Programmers who studied early versions of the Bitcoin client noted the style of writing was unusual. It showed a mathematician, a cryptographer, and an engineer all at once. Part of the code was too academic, as if written by someone with a university background. Another part, on the contrary, looked as though it had been written by a loner, working nights without a team. The inconsistency only fueled rumors. On forums, Satoshi behaved extremely reservedly. He replied only to the point, avoided emotion, never spoke of personal things. But at times, oddities slipped through. In one post, he mentioned a printed article from the 90s, available only in narrow circles of cryptographers. In another, he referred to a Japanese academic journal. It seemed he was either a genius polymath or a group of people with different backgrounds. And most importantly, Satoshi was always slightly ahead. While others debated, "But can this work?" he would answer briefly, "Try it. The code is open." And his silent confidence frightened and fascinated at the same time. But the real hunt began when people started comparing these traces with real personalities. Soon the first suspects appeared, and each seemed a convincing candidate. But none ever became indisputable proof. The list of possible Satoshis long ago turned into a separate genre. Journalists, cryptographers, intelligence services, all searched for the face behind the pseudonym. And each time they found someone who seemed too fitting. The first on this list was Hal Finney, a programmer, cryptographer, one of the first to run Bitcoin and to receive the first transaction from Satoshi. His knowledge of cryptography, participation in the privacy movement, and communication style made him the ideal candidate. But Hal denied authorship until the end of his life. "I was just an early user," he said. And yet many believe he was Satoshi, and modesty and denials were part of the legend. Next, Nick Szabo, a scientist, developer of the concept of smart contracts back in the 90s. His articles were too similar to Satoshi's texts, and his ideas of bit gold anticipated Bitcoin almost exactly. Linguists even compared their writing styles. The matches were frighteningly precise. But Szabo always avoided direct questions. Then there was Dorian Nakamoto, an elderly engineer from California, whom journalists in 2014 accused of being Satoshi. The surname matched, the biography looked strangely plausible. But Dorian himself was the most surprised. "I don't even know what Bitcoin is." And of course, there was no shortage of conspiracy theories. Some pointed to entire teams of programmers, others to the CIA or NSA. After all, a project of such scale was too difficult for one person to implement. And who benefits from a system that can topple banks, perhaps those who want to control money globally. The list of candidates grew. Each new suspect added details to the legend, but no proof was ever found, and the mystery only deepened. Along with it, the mythology. But in any investigation, there always comes a moment when you need to ask, why did this person disappear? And why exactly at the moment when his project began to gain strength? Where there is a mystery, conspiracies are always born. And the story of Satoshi Nakamoto was no exception. Too much in his appearance and disappearance looked not like coincidence, but like a carefully planned operation. 9 pages of perfect text, code that worked from the first version. Silent, polite, but ironclad behavior on forums. And then, a sudden retreat into the shadows. To many it looked as if Satoshi was not a person, but an entire organization. The most popular theory, intelligence services, the American NSA, the British GCHQ, Japanese or even Russian structures. The logic is simple. Who but a state is capable of creating a technology that so deeply affects the financial system? Perhaps it was an experiment, a new weapon in economic war, or on the contrary, a trap. Give people the illusion of freedom, then control it. There were other versions as well, for example, that Bitcoin was created by bankers. It sounds paradoxical, but if you think about it, ingenious. Show the world an alternative, and then gradually take control of it. After all, it was banks that later became the largest investors in blockchain. Some saw the hand of corporations, Google, Microsoft, or someone else. The idea of a decentralized network looked too modern. The accents were placed too competently. But the deeper you dig, the more you understand. A conspiracy theory is a convenient screen. It explains everything and nothing. If Satoshi is an intelligence agent, why is his code open? If banks are behind him, why did they so fiercely resist cryptocurrencies at the start? If corporations, why didn't they use the Bitcoin brand for profit? And yet one thing is clear. The legend became stronger than reality. Even if Satoshi was just a lone genius, the world still preferred to believe in the shadow. Because the shadow is always scarier and more interesting. And his disappearance in 2011 was what finally turned the story into a myth. Satoshi's disappearance is the moment when the legend finally grew into a myth. Until 2011, he still appeared on forums, replied to emails, discussed code details. His style remained unchanged, polite, dry, as if he consciously cut off everything superfluous. But one day it ended. In the spring, he wrote his last message. "I've moved on to other things. Bitcoin is in good hands." And that was it. Not another word. Not a single post. Not a single email. He disappeared as if he had never existed. At first, the community thought it was temporary, that he would return when the project strengthened. But years passed, Bitcoin grew, and Satoshi never returned. His email addresses fell silent. Accounts were no longer used. The mystery only intensified. Why leave precisely when Bitcoin began to conquer the world? One version, he was afraid. After Bitcoin began to be used on darknet markets like Silk Road, the FBI took an interest. Perhaps Satoshi realized he was being hunted, and it was better to vanish than end up in handcuffs. Another version, that was the plan from the beginning. Create the system, give it to the people, and leave so that no one could call it a stranger's project. If Satoshi's identity were known, Bitcoin would never have become a symbol of freedom. It would have been that man's money. But by disappearing, he turned himself into a void, into a legend around which everyone could build their own version. But disappearance did not mean the end. On the contrary, from that moment the strangest chapter began. The story of a gigantic treasure that has lain untouched for decades. Satoshi's treasure is perhaps the loudest and at the same time the quietest argument in this story. According to analysts' calculations, in the first months of the network's operation, Nakamoto mined about 1 million bitcoins. Back then, they were just lines in code, a toy no one was interested in. Today, this toy is worth tens of billions of dollars. But the main thing, these coins lie untouched. Years go by, the price rises, and Satoshi's wallets remain dead. Not a single transaction, not a single movement. It is like a chest of gold buried in the middle of a square, which everyone can see but no one can open. Why? There are many versions. One, he died. His coins remain because there is no one left to manage them. Another, he consciously took a vow of silence. These coins are not mine. This is the foundation of the system. If he began to spend them, the price would crash, trust would vanish. Bitcoin would cease to be the people's money. There is also a conspiratorial version. The wallets are under the control of intelligence services. They keep them as a button. If Bitcoin becomes too strong, the market can be crashed by dumping 1 million coins. But whatever the case, the fact remains. 1 million Bitcoins still sleep. And this silence is louder than any words. It sustains the myth. It makes people believe in the sanctity of Bitcoin. After all, if the creator himself does not spend his coins, it means the project is above personal gain. This treasure has become part of the cult. Some see in it a symbol of honesty, others a time bomb. But all agree. As long as these coins remain motionless, Satoshi remains a shadow. Meanwhile, Bitcoin was turning into the banner of an entire movement. People who called themselves crypto-anarchists picked it up like a flag. And a new war began, a war of ideas. When Satoshi's name disappeared, others took up his cause. People who called themselves crypto-anarchists. They were programmers, activists, hackers, former students, idealists, and cynics at once. They were united by one idea. The world must be free from the control of the state and banks. Bitcoin became for them not just money, it became a weapon. In chats and on forums they wrote, "If we use Bitcoin, states will lose power." For them, every transaction was a small act of resistance. It didn't matter whether you were buying coffee with Bitcoin or transferring millions of dollars. All this happened past banks, past tax systems, past those who were used to monitoring every movement of money. Crypto-anarchists saw in this a chance to build a new world. They were inspired by old texts from the 90s that spoke of a digital underground. They believed the internet should be a free space where censorship and coercion do not exist. And Bitcoin fit this philosophy perfectly. But as always, a revolution is never pure. Soon Bitcoin became the currency of the darknet. On the Silk Road marketplace you could buy everything, from drugs to forged passports. And all of it for Bitcoins. For some, this was proof. The system works. For others, a verdict. Bitcoin is money for criminals. What's interesting, though, even the scandals strengthened Bitcoin. When the FBI shut down Silk Road, the coin's price did not collapse for good. On the contrary, it survived the fall and began to rise again. Crypto-anarchists said, "You can shut down websites, but you won't shut down the code. It lives on its own." Thus, Bitcoin turned into a flag, first for idealists, then for criminals, then for investors. But next it had to face those against whom it had been created in the first place, the biggest money on the planet, the banks. Bitcoin's story could not remain apart from the underground. Wherever anonymous money appears, Dark markets always arise. The loudest of them was Silk Road, the Silk Road. In 2011, deep in the darknet, a site appeared that looked like an ordinary online store. But instead of shoes and books, it sold prohibited substances, forged documents, weapons, and all of it for bitcoins. The blockchain made it possible to conduct deals without banks and intermediaries, and the darknet hid participants from the eyes of the police. It became a sensation. Newspapers wrote, "Bitcoin, the currency of criminals." Politicians demanded it be banned. But with every scandal, interest in the new technology only grew. Authorities hunted Silk Road for a long time, and when the FBI arrested its creator, Ross Ulbricht, and the site was shut down, Bitcoin did not disappear. Yes, the price fell. But a few months later, it rose again, even higher. This became the first proof. You cannot destroy Bitcoin by closing a single platform. It existed independently. Paradoxically, it was the darknet that made Bitcoin famous. Before Silk Road, only geeks and enthusiasts knew about it. After, the whole world heard of it. People understood. There is a system that works past banks and states. And if it works for criminals, it means it can work for everyone. Bitcoin emerged from the underground and stepped into the world of big money. And now those who were most irritated by it began to watch it: the banks and Wall Street. At first, the banks laughed. In 2010, Bitcoin cost less than $1. In 2011, about 10. On Wall Street, they waved dismissively, "Another geek toy, a bubble that will burst like thousands of others." But the years passed, the price rose, and the smiles began to disappear. By 2013, Bitcoin broke through the $1,000 mark. Newspapers wrote, "New gold, a threat to the financial system." And then the banks understood. This is not just a toy. This is a real alternative. Every dollar that went into cryptocurrency was a dollar they were losing from their systems. The banks began to act. Some demanded that states ban cryptocurrencies. Others, to develop their own analogs. Still others, to invest in blockchain, while calling Bitcoin itself fraud. The famous Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan said, "It's a fraud. It will collapse." But a couple of years later, the same bank began launching its own blockchain projects. Wall Street has always played by one rule: if you can't kill the enemy, buy him. And soon Bitcoin began to be used by the very corporations against which it had originally rebelled. Hedge funds opened crypto funds, banks launched crypto divisions. But Bitcoin was an inconvenient enemy. It had no office, no director, no legal entity. You couldn't subpoena it or buy a controlling stake. It existed as code that belonged to no one. And this is precisely what drove bankers mad. However, the banks were not the only ones who felt threatened. Far more dangerous was the attention of states. Because if banks lose money, that's a business problem. But if states lose control over money issuance, that's a threat to power. When states realized that Bitcoin was not just a toy for enthusiasts, a real attack began. China struck first. There, the authorities saw a threat to their financial system in cryptocurrency and imposed a ban on trading and mining. Exchanges were closing one after another, but the network did not disappear. Miners went underground or moved to other countries. The United States chose a different strategy. They did not ban it completely, but brought in regulators. The tax service demanded reporting. Commissions began to develop rules. Bitcoin was being driven into the framework of the law, tamed like a wild beast. Europe followed the same path: controls, licenses, reporting. Each state acted in its own way, but all understood one thing: Bitcoin hits at the very heart of power. After all, Money is not only a means of exchange, but also an instrument of control. Whoever controls the currency controls the people. And Bitcoin slipped away. But the more they pressed, the more it grew. Bans and loud statements did not destroy it. On the contrary, they fueled interest. People saw in it a symbol of resistance. Bitcoin was becoming something more than a technology. It was turning into an idea. And it was at this moment that the cult of Satoshi was born. A person no one had seen. A name behind which stood a shadow. The cult of Satoshi is what turns Bitcoin from a technology into a legend. In a world where every product has a creator, every company a director, and every corporation a board of directors, Bitcoin stands apart. Its author disappeared. His face is unknown. His voice is silent. And it is precisely this void that became a sacred symbol. The community began treating the name Satoshi Nakamoto almost like a religious sign. On forums, he was quoted like a prophet. "We remove intermediaries. We trust the code." People created memes, posters, even altars. In conference halls, you could find portraits of Satoshi drawn like icons, and every unspent coin from his treasure was perceived as a relic. There is a rational kernel in the cult of Satoshi. If he were known, Bitcoin would long ago have become a foreign project. Authorities would pressure his person, banks would discredit his biography, journalists would pick apart the details. But the absence of a name made Bitcoin untouchable. You cannot destroy someone who isn't there. This void allowed millions of people to see in Bitcoin not a project of a particular person, but an idea belonging to everyone. Everyone could invest their own meaning in it. For some, it is a revolt against banks. For others, an investment. For still others, a symbol of freedom. Thus, the myth of Satoshi became stronger than any biography. He ceased to be a person. He became a shadow that cannot be caught. And faith always follows a shadow. But any myth has a limit. And the main question remains open. What happens next? For one day, Bitcoin will have to prove that it can live without the legend. The future of Bitcoin is a future without a name. Satoshi disappeared, and that is precisely his strength. Now everything depends not on one person, but on millions. Those who hold their coins, run nodes, mine blocks, argue on forums, and write new code. Today, Bitcoin is not just numbers in a blockchain. It is the economy that has grown around it. Exchanges, funds, startups, wallets. It is millions of people around the world who believe that in their hands is something more than money. And at the same time, it is millions of skeptics who are sure it will all end in a crash. But the most interesting thing, Bitcoin has already changed the world, even if it disappears tomorrow. It showed that you can create a currency without a state, that you can build a system that works without a center, that trust can be replaced by code. This is a lesson that will remain forever. The future of Bitcoin depends on three questions. First, will states try to destroy it or recognize it as part of the system? Second, will it withstand competition with other cryptocurrencies and central bank digital currencies? And third, will the faith remain? Because without faith, no algorithms will save it. Satoshi created not just a technology, he created a myth that became stronger than any law. And perhaps it is precisely for this reason that he left. Because he knew, if the author dies as a name, his idea will live as a legend. And today, looking at the price of Bitcoin, at newspaper headlines, at politicians' hysterics, and at the millions of people who continue to buy and hold coins, we can say only one thing. The story is just beginning. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, See you soon.